Hello everyone. So recently I got these models out of my lead mountain and painted them up, and I thought it would be an opportunity to not so much talk about these figures but to chat on the subject of lead mountains again, and a little bit of nostalgia for you as well. So I have an extremely large lead mountain, as you probably know. It's built up over the years for a number of reasons. One is that I paint a lot more slowly than I purchase, so because I've been wargaming many years, it's built up in that respect as well. I get enthused about a project, I buy a whole set of figures to paint up for it, and then paint them very slowly, and halfway through I sort of lose a bit of enthusiasm for that project to move on to another, and the rump of what's left unpainted ends up in the lead mountain, and I keep saying to myself I'll come get back to it one day. So that's one reason it's built up. Another is that I'm always very aware that figures that I like the look of, at the time, often when I get round to purchasing them or wanting to purchase them, they've disappeared. Ranges disappear alarmingly quickly. Sometimes, there are figure ranges that have been around a long time, decades, but others that come and go, and I always regret not buying figures that are no longer available. So it's kind of a fear of missing out. And then the final one is that I think it's a good investment to buy figures and just keep them stored away for future use. Not even, fearing the fact that they might not be available one day. It's just buying figures when you can afford to, and keeping them there ready for when you want to get around to painting them, and when you might not be able to afford to purchase them. So they're the three reasons really why my lead mountain has grown. But there is this added element. A lot of people refer to piles of shame and shelves of shame, and there is a sort of an element of guilt, a guilty conscience about having all these figures and letting them just idle and waste on in boxes and so on, and not get around to painting them. And as you're probably aware, I'd recently got an interest in painting up some feudal and early medieval figures, and in particular I was going to start off with sort of jousting scenarios using crossed lances, the rules crossed lances for jousts. And I was very aware that I had these figures in my lead mountain. I certainly didn't buy them any later than the 1990s. I might even have purchased these in the 1980s, but I can remember having these in my previous residence, and that was back in the 1990s, so they're certainly at least 30 years since I purchased them. They are irregular miniatures, the Joust pack, still available. I'll put up a picture of them from the Irregulars website, and you'll see that I've arranged these painted figures in the same kind of grouping as they've got displayed on their website. Yeah, they're still available, but I bought them, as I say, at least 30 years ago, and I thought, if I'm not going to paint them now when I'm into jousts, then when am I going to paint them? It was that my sort of guilty conscience pricking me. So I thought, rather than paint the figures that I purchased in the last couple of months, I would get these done first of all. So it's kind of eased my conscience a little bit to get them done. But I have to say, a lot of you will be familiar with Irregular. They've been around an awfully long time in the still going strong, but their figures are very variable in standard and quality, and that's very much the case in this group here. At one time, they were a great resource for going to get obscure, periods of history and so on. They date back to a time when there weren't that many figure manufacturers around, and you would often be obliged to purchase their figures to get obscure armies together and so on. If you suddenly got enthused about a Timurid army or something like that, then Irregular were the only place to go. But as I say, their figures are very variable. Some of them are pretty good, and others are just lumpy bits of metal. And even in this group, I'll zoom in a little bit now so you can see some of the figures in a little bit more. It's probably not going to focus any closer than that. But the woman seated in the chair watching the joust is really hard to work out what the detail on her actually represents. She's just like a solid slab of metal, whereas the guy there, I actually think is a pretty good figure. So the whole group as a whole is going to come in handy. It's just going to be almost like scatter terrain in my games. The figures aren't going to feature very prominently. I mean, there's another chap here. It's really sort of weird imagination going on with the sculptor. It's hard to say what period of history that figure actually comes from. It looks almost like he's wearing some kind of Roman toga. He's got a dog that looks a bit like an Alsatian with him. He seems to be wearing, items of ornament, like a kind of bracelet type thing, and almost like a necktie around his throat. And he's drinking out of something that looks like a bit like a Greek amphora. Really hard to make him out, other than to tell that he's a bit of a drunken bystander having a jolly time at the joust. But he doesn't really match the period in terms of his dress or anything, whereas some of them, so if I show you that guy there, and this is another thing about Irregular, I'll show you in a moment, just as a sort of another part of this sort of nostalgia trip, that sculpt is actually modelled on an illustration in a Lillian and Fred Funken book. So I've painted it exactly as it appears in the book. But here's the sort of herald with a parchment with the heraldry of all the various knights who are taking part in the joust. And this sword as well it's an emblematic sword that he carries sort of by the sort of blade end. Again, I'll come back to that when I show you the illustration. The two jousting knights, very very solid lumpy bits of metal, but they've painted up okay. I'm quite pleased with the way they painted up. So quite happy to have those, and I might even actually use those in cross lances. They're going to be fairly useful figures to have. Things like the flags and the tents rather. Again, a bit coarse and crudely cast and so on, but they'll do as little extra bits of terrain. Yeah, right. So now let me show you. It has brought back memories painting these, of painting Irregular miniatures way back in the 80s and 90s, and one of my chief sources was a book here Let's zoom out quite a bit. Lillian and Fred Funken, costume, armour and arms in the time of chivalry, from the 8th to the 15th centuries. So fantastic reference book, this. I'll go through some of the pages in a moment, but I've got it open to begin with at this page here with this Harold, and you can see he's pretty clearly the inspiration for that sculpt. So I've painted him up in exactly the same way. The heralds would have worn the livery of the person who was hosting the tournament. So he's in the heraldry in the livery of the Duke of Brittany. So I've copied that completely. But this book, I just love this book. It is just full. It's almost sort of that transition between getting excited about comic books and magazines and things as a boy, and going into a more kind of serious approach to painting figures and such like. But it is just chock full of fantastic illustrations, not just of heraldry and so on. I mean, just take a look. There's just some beautiful heraldic garb and so on there, those knights there. I actually use some of the schemes in this book as sort of inspiration for my painting there. That guy there is the inspiration for this one here. Yeah, but it's not only got that, but it's got detailed sections on tournaments, on the evolution of armour, on castles and fortifications, on weapons, as you can see there, siege machines, all kinds of things. And it is a little bit, it's got the, when you go through it, it's got that excitement of a sort of boyhood immersion in a sort of comic or something like that, but as I say, lots of really useful detail in here, and even sort of tweaks little coincidental kind of thrills in you, because there's this particular illustration here, number 5, is the Chateau of Coucy. So if any of you have ever read A Distant Mirror by Barbara Tuchman, which is about the life of Enguerrand de Coucy, this was actually his castle. So little coincidences like that just really sort of thrill me, and it goes right back to the Normans and pre-Norman sort of period, the sort of later Carolingians and so on, so the sort of later Frankish period, so from Charlemagne right the way through to the period of the late 100 Years' War, end of the 100 Years' War. I just think it's a fantastic book. So if you ever see it in a used bookshop or something like that, grab a copy of it. You don't really even need to understand the French, because the pictures on their own are worth looking at. So it brought back, there's another fun bit of painting these figures was that it did it did provoke that kind of nostalgia in me. So I really enjoyed painting them up, and it's eased my conscience a little bit, so now I can get on to painting some of those more recent purchases. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. Bye for now.